not
I'm
a
not a host, that's why.
co-host.
Okay, that's okay. I don't need to be part of that. I just was looking to make sure that could happen.
Yeah, Deb, I'll be dropping some links in the chat throughout the presentation. If there's anything specifically that you want to make sure is dropped in there, feel free to shoot me a message real quick and I can make sure that gets on my list.
Yeah, and it looks like I can message you, so.
Sounds good.
Yeah, Jaden stopped in before the meeting, and by the way, this is now live on YouTube. Jaden stopped in to ask me about the chat and what to do because you guys did not want it sent to everyone, as far as I knew. So it was going to be separate from everybody being able to see it. Because then it opens it up for everyone as attendees to be able to type back and forth also to everyone.
Okay, so Amber, can you see everyone though? Okay,
Yeah, so Liam and I, since we're the co-hosts, are able to
okay,
send chats to all of the attendees.
okay, that's good. As long as somebody can.
And I'm going to hand this over to which one wants it, Liam or Amber, as host. I have to hand it off to someone because if I leave, then it gets dropped.
Probably Amber, I
Okay.
guess.
That's fine, you can pass it to me.
Okay. So don't forget, it is the recording's paused. YouTube is now live, and everything we say now is being recorded. So I'll stay on for about 5 minutes, and then once I see that it's everything's running smoothly, I will back out and listen to YouTube.
Thanks, Pat.
Do
Yep.
I need to unpause the recording when it starts, Pat?
Yeah. You'll just
Okay.
hit the play button.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Montana River Recreation Management Workshops. We'll get started here in just a few seconds, just to allow anyone who's just running a little bit late. Would really appreciate everyone being here this evening. This is our first workshop of 3. We'll be hosting the first one tonight from 6 to 7:30, and we'll be hosting one on Thursday as well, and Monday as well. These each run for about an hour and a half. We'll be presenting information on river recreation management across the state here in Montana, and we'll be collecting public input and having a thorough discussion at the end of these workshops. I appreciate everyone who's here taking the time to be a part of this process. We'll be providing you with an agenda for the workshops. Each of these workshops will be similar in nature. So if there's only one that you can make, that's totally okay. You do not need to attend all 3. These workshops will be recorded and they will be posted onto the webpage so you can review them and reference them as you need. Information from these workshops will be collected and recorded, and so we'll be able to work back on what was presented, what was shared amongst you as the public, and here was presented by us at FWP and staff. We'll go ahead and get started here so we can save as much time for some of the public input and discussion questions at the end. This is a quick overview of the agenda for this evening. My name is Liam Harry. I am the Parks and Outdoor Recreation Planner for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. My colleague here, Amber Lopatin, is also part of that Parks and Outdoor Recreation Division. We have a few other staff online as well in supporting these efforts and presenting this information. We'll get into some examples of river recreation management, current practices, how that's done, a couple of those case studies with some of our staff from across the state later on in this presentation. But first, we'll kind of roll through the process design, how we're rolling through this design, the public engagement that we're approaching through this kind of design, into some of the legislative and regulatory framework that we have, that we abide by, and then a little bit of the background on river recreation management here in Montana. And then a little look at how we manage, what tools, what methods we use today, and kind of formulating, making decisions around river recreation management. Like I mentioned, we'll then jump into a few case studies, examples of how that's done on specific sites in management areas and rivers across the state. And then we'll dive into the majority of this workshop, which will be the public input and discussion on river recreation management, hearing your thoughts, your ideas, your input into how you see fit river recreation management in Montana going, some of the current challenges, some of those current trends that you're seeing across the state. And then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end as well for any questions and answers portions there. And I'll finish out with a quick conclusion. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So what you're probably wondering, you probably heard a little bit about the press release that went out. What is the main purpose of these workshops? So the main purpose of these workshops is to kind of collect and share that information about your river recreation experience. What are those challenges? What are those trends that you see around river recreation in Montana? This information will be collected. We'll summarize that information from these workshops and we'll inform the River Recreation Advisory Council. Now, the RRAC is been pulled together to develop a portfolio of ideas and a set of recommendations for the department for future considerations on river recreation management. That process is on its way right now. We sent out applications, solicit for applications beginning in July, and they closed August 2nd. Now, the focus and scope of the workshops, as well as the overall process for the for the RAC extends the department lands in Class 1 waters. These are similar waters or rivers that provide for recreation opportunity and that are under the authority of FWP. This does include recreation use on and along these waterways and includes the fishing access sites themselves. So a little overview of the process design and the public engagement and the process that we're taking on. Phase 1 was recruitment for the RAC Council. We opened those for applications, as I mentioned, in early July. Those closed August 2nd. Those applications are currently in review. We're seeking review and hopeful approval in the next couple weeks. We received about 27 applications throughout the state, and we're able to identify 12 recommended members. We're now at the stage of the workshops, the first of the 3 virtual workshops to gather that public input. We will have an additional river recreation survey that will be available to the public as well. This will be an additional set of information and public input collected that will go into a report for the RAC. Now, once the RAC is approved, we announce those members. We'll be convening the members. The members will convene for an in-person meeting in mid-October. They'll be presented with the information from the workshops, as well as the river recreation survey. And then they will work together within that meeting time for the 3 days to formulate the recommendations for river recreation management across the state. Now, after they convene and have their meetings in mid-October, they'll present their final recommendations, and we'll at that point allow for public comment on those recommendations. That is scheduled at sometime in mid-November. And following that presentation, summarizing the public comments, we'll then the RAC will provide the final recommendations with the inclusion of the public comments to the department by mid-December. Now, a little background on the legislative and regulatory framework. The FWP Commission regulates recreational use on public waters under broad authority. This is the balanced public access, opportunity, and resource protection. Now, this is a list of broad authority, commission rulemaking, and a department authority that we are guided by for making river recreation management plans, as well as decisions around river recreation management. We will be able to provide the links if you want to look in further to each of these rules, what the authority brings to the commission. But this is just a quick broad overview of how we implement these processes, collect information, and seeking out how we are to formulate and identify both issues and challenges and be able to make decisions around river recreation management across the state. Now, a little bit about river recreation management here in Montana. Back in the 60s and 70s, primarily FASs were starting to become established. We have over 338 sites at this time. Those were primarily focused around angling. Angling is the recreation activity. As time moved on, the Montana Stream Access Law was put in place. This allowed for public use of waters for water-based recreation, generally. In 2004, statewide river recreation rules were adopted by the commission to help guide river recreation management and planning. As you're noticing as well, there are links to each of these rules, so feel free to click on those and review those as as you feel needed. Then kind of as time moved on, we started to recognize in 2016, 51% of FAS usage involved non-fishing activities. So there was kind of a trend and a change in the way that we were managing these spaces in these rivers, starting to recognize that angling was not the primary activity, or not the only activity, I should say, and that there were a diverse number of activities occurring. And then we are beginning to see increased use, as well as trying to identify equitable opportunity for each of these diverse uses. So as time moved on, a certain number of rivers started to establish specific and special river recreation management rules and permitting to provide for equitable opportunity, diverse activities, and provide for that spectrum of use. And so over time, we've had the development of special rules and permitting for a number of rivers across the state, both working with other agencies as well as within FWP. And a list of those rivers are listed here on the screen. Now, when we start to think about river recreation management today here within Parks and Outdoor Recreation and how we manage these spaces, we have quite a few tools and methods here that we use on a daily basis. How we identify issues, how we collect information, and how we implement and deploy some of the programs that we have. And so a lot of it can come down to staff, information, and education, increasing staff presence in areas where we're starting to see increased usage, additional social conflicts. We collect data, and we provide user education. So signage, maps, pamphlets, as much information as we can in various channels. Now, we also have permit systems and licenses, so information that we can collect through the FAS permit, the commercial use permits, and conservation licenses and fishing licenses. So licenses that are required at either to fish on and along the rivers here in Montana, or a conservation license that is required for fishing access sites or other similar FWP sites outside of state parks. We also have, we use the tool of agreements and coordination. So we work with other partners across the state, whether that's other agencies, landowners, other entities, nonprofits, to improve not only access, but supporting decision-making and guiding in how we should approach river recreation management across the state. In certain cases, we also have river management plans in place. Both the Smith River and the Blackfoot have management plans that are in place, very thorough documents that help guide how those spaces and sites are to be managed for. We also have a Montana River Recreation Planning Manual, which guides and provides additional information on how we go about processes to receive public input on managing rivers across the state, as well as how we deploy and implement those methods. In addition to that, we have various ways of collecting data, as well as monitoring use across the state. Those in the past, that it's generally been fisheries related data, so angler pressure surveys and creel surveys. And since the reorg, we've been able to collect additional information and ongoing information about permitting and licensing across the state, as I mentioned before. Some of the commercial use reporting data for specific rivers across the state. We also have cameras and vehicle counter data to identify visitation counts. And then in certain instances, we have in-person surveys, and then of course, public input and public comment on management processes and management plans as they move kind of through the decision-making process. So we have a lot of tools that are in our belt here to make some decisions, but here tonight we're trying to identify some of these larger trends, some of these challenges that might help support these efforts in identifying a holistic view on river recreation management across the entirety of the state. Now, this is a map of land management and access sites along rivers, the waterways across the state of Montana. In the brown circled dots, those are FWP FAS sites, so fishing access sites. So 338 of them along throughout the state. You can see the upside down triangles are BLM sites, and there are a few scattered U.S. Forest Service access sites as well. And so this is to kind of give you a broad understanding of what land management agency has the authority and has the ability to manage these specific sites, and the interaction that we have with working with other agencies on river systems that run along and next to other management sites with other agencies. So this is to help kind of build your frame an understanding of a statewide level that can allow us to really understand the holistic view of river recreation management without dialing too deep into just one section, to realize the amount of work this will take and the amount of work that we have ahead of us to understand how river recreation management can be improved going forward. In addition to that map, we have a second map here. This is to help kind of present some information on special rivers with special restrictions or use restrictions in place. And generally, these can be a combination of working with other agencies, special recreation permits through the BLM. There's also wild and scenic designated rivers, so you can see in the blue. And in some cases, these use restrictions do vary, and so they vary by possibly the limiting of permits that are available, limiting of use days, limiting of the amount of times that you can float on the river, and what days and times. And so there can be very broad kind of implications to this. There can be broad tools and ways to navigate how you want to implement restrictions and how to best kind of be able to provide for opportunity in various different ways. And so this is to give a general frame of what we have out there currently, and what's being implemented at this time. You can see the Smith River in the green as well is one that is restricted both with public or private and commercial permitting, which is limited in an allocated source to the use of that river. And so we'll be jumping into some of these examples. We have some staff that are here to present. But first, I'm going to share a quick little video with everyone, and feel free to listen in and watch.
Streams write the story of Montana, from the Badlands of the Missouri Breaks to the towering cliffs of the Smith, the forested banks and mountainous backdrop of the Blackfoot, the waters of the Flathead, rich with biodiversity, sanctuaries for wildlife, and opportunities for recreation. A storied history of native culture, prospectors, and explorers evolved to legendary fly fishing, floating, adventure, and excitement. Serene flat water, blue ribbon trout streams, deep canyons, and raging whitewater attract visitors from across the world. Lifelong memories are made here. Camaraderie with friends, the thrill of adventure, and spectacular scenery rejuvenate the soul. Your actions to help preserve our majestic rivers will be rewarded with an unforgettable experience in the last best place.
I hope that helps kind of frame some of the unique and amazing opportunities that Montana has to offer around river recreation. And what what that video does provide for me and for a lot of people is some of the education pieces that we've worked on here at FWP, working with collaborative groups to present information on river recreation, to identify some of those challenges. And in that video, you can see the broad spectrum of opportunities, the type of river recreation that occurs, as well as what needs to happen for everyone to enjoy that experience. And so that's just the start of a 3-video series that is available. We can provide that information. You can find that information on the webpage in the website as well, about information around planning, permitting, getting yourself ready to recreate on the river. And so now we're going to jump into some of the current management and practice, some spectrum of kind of these methods and tools that are being used across different river systems here in Montana. And so first we'll hear in regards to the Smith River with Colin, and then we'll jump over to the Blackfoot River and hear from Chrissy, and then to the Missouri River and listen with Cannon. And so we'll have the opportunity for them to share information on how they're currently managing their specific rivers. And go ahead and take it away, Colin.
Alrighty. Thank you, Liam, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and taking the time to spend with us tonight. As Liam mentioned earlier, when he was showing the map of some of the rivers in Montana and some of the current management restrictions we have, many of you on this video watching this or attending this workshop tonight are probably familiar with the Smith River, that it is a fully rationed restricted use river, meaning that it is the only permitted river in the state of Montana, meaning that you need to apply in a lottery to draw a permit to actually float the Smith River if you're a private floater. And then we also do manage the commercial outfitters as far as the number of launches that they're allowed, and some other regulations regarding outfitters. And so the Smith River, again, how we got from no restrictions to a fully restricted river didn't happen overnight. It was a progression, and it happened over several years and actually, several decades. And so kind of the impetus, or the thing that really kickstarted the interest in the Smith River years ago, was just a recognition of increasing use in the 1960s and 70s, especially. There was use documented, I think, all the way back to the 1940s and 50s as far as documented use, but it really started to increase the 60s and 70s. And a lot of that had to do with conflicts. For those of you who are, again, familiar with the Smith River, most of the land that borders it is private, about 80% private. So a lot of those conflicts were occurring with private landowners: trespass, litter, fire rings, cutting fences, livestock getting out of pastures into areas they weren't supposed to be. And Montanans and lawmakers and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and other interested parties recognize that, gosh, we have this incredible resource. We have this 60-mile stretch of incredible limestone canyon in the middle of Montana, where there's great trout fishing, incredible scenery, where you can actually do a multi-day overnight trip. And we can't let this opportunity escape us. We can't let something like, the private landowners shut everything down. We got to do what we can to try to save this incredible opportunity for the public. So there again, that was kind of the impetus. And so what the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks did is they actually, in 1980, they hired the very first river ranger, and the department started to gather some of that data that Liam was talking about earlier, that data gathering. So the river ranger at the Camp Baker Put-in was gathering data there. We had volunteer hosts at the Edenbridge Takeout. They were gathering data there. And then in 1986, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks hired a consultant, a gentleman named Joel Schaus out of Bozeman, to do a study. And so he called it the Smith River Study. And from that study, he came up with some management recommendations. And those were to continue to monitor use, which the department was doing, to every few years take a look at capacity, reevaluate the capacity. The department had come up with, I think it was like, based on how much public land there was in the river and how many designated boat camps there were, which they had at that time. I think they determined that the capacity was about 100 people per day. Another recommendation was to if and when the department made a decision to implement any kind of rules or regulations on the Smith River, the recommendation was that, hey, let's do it in staged, in staged capacities, you know, kind of from 1 to 5, with 1 being the least restrictive, all the way to number 5 being the most restrictive. For example, you know, number 1 was a voluntary reservation system, which the department did implement, and then eventually all the way to stage 5, which is a permit system, the most restrictive. And then the other really important thing, the next bullet, and put a pin in this one, was to clarify and improve authority to regulate use. In other words, he recommended that the department should probably seek some specific legislative authority. In other words, another statute, another law in the books that would give the department a little more teeth and a little more ability to manage the Smith River specifically, above and beyond. And pardon me, that should, rather than saying ARM, it should say MCA, meaning Montana Code Annotated, which is statute, and those are titles 23 and 87. That Liam had referred to in his legislative and authority framework slide. But those were the recreational use of streams statute, and then also the statute for rules for the use of lands and waters. And those were kind of the 2 big broad ones. But he recommended, you know, we should probably have something a little more specific to the Smith River. And then he also recommended user fees. Next slide, please. And so then, lo and behold, in 1988, 2 years later, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks drafted the first management plan for the Smith River. And as you can see here, you're looking at some of these bullets and say, hey, those look a lot like the slide that we just looked at, because they really are. So the department pretty much verbatim adopted most, if not several, if not most, of the recommendations from the 1986 study into the 1988 management plan. Next slide. And one other thing that the department did in that management plan, they came up with a goal statement. And the 3 main goals were to provide continued use and enjoyment consistent with the river's capacity to maintain that use, minimize conflicts between private users and private landowners, and then lastly, protect the integrity of the river's water and canyon resources for future generations. And remember those. Next slide, please. So then what the department did is 3 years later, 1989, they did pursue implementing a statute, a law. They introduced a bill, and they found a lawmaker to carry the bill, and they called it the Smith River Management Act. It was signed into law by the governor in 1989, and the purpose and intent, those 3 bullets look really familiar. Well, again, those were just about verbatim the goals that were pulled out of the 1988 management plan and were put into the language of the Smith River Management Act in 1989. Again, providing continued enjoyment of the recreational and commercial use of the Smith, consistent with its capacity, minimize conflicts between the users and private landowners, and then protect the integrity of the natural resources for future generations. This was applicable to Camp Baker all the way to the confluence, although right now all we do really manage is Camp Baker to Eden Bridge. And then it also gave the department some management responsibilities, a little more detail. And these responsibilities were to allow the continuation of compatible existing recreational and public land uses, maintain the opportunity to enjoy the natural scenic beauty and solitude, and lastly, conserve the fish and wildlife, scientific and recreational values. So that was a little more detailed. Next slide. It also granted, the Management Act granted Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks the rulemaking authority. First, it was the Fish, Wildlife, and Commission, and then later the Parks and Recreation Board to continue to manage use, look at adopting additional rules and regulations if needed. And then it also gave the ability to implement user fees, and then it also created what's called the corridor enhancement account. I won't go into that. That's a lot more detail, but that actually tells the department where to allocate specific fees and where specific fees are earmarked and how they should be used. And so real quickly, you can kind of see some of the restrictions that were then implemented once the management plan of 1989 was passed. 91, 92, 93, 96, kind of that progression in management, kind of from the least restrictive to the most restrictive. In 91, fees, boat tags, maximum group size of 15, and voluntary pre-registration were some of the first things that were implemented. Then in 92, outfitters were capped at 73 launches, and they became mandatory for pre-registering. 93, the total number of launches and number of outfitters were capped, and then a mandatory pre-registration for private floaters. Then eventually, 3 years later, 96, the full-on permit system for private groups through the lottery drawing. Next slide. So here we have our present day restrictions. Again, it's a fully permitted river where you have to draw a permit to float it if you're a private floater. Non-residents are now limited to 20%. There's also a bonus point that was implemented this past year. 9 launches per day are allowed. That's private and outfitted, 15 people per group. Outfitters are still capped at 73 launches per year. They operate off of what we call a permanent launch calendar. And then they have certain number of launches that they're allowed on certain days of the week. Next slide. And then again, lastly, as Liam mentioned, prior to the Smith River becoming permitted, we collected data, and obviously to this day, we still collect a lot of data. So I won't go through all the specific types of data, but the 3 main areas where we collect data are from our licensing division, who conducts the lottery drawing. We get information from that. We also get probably most of our information from our registration forms. Next slide. And then lastly, we also do get quite a bit of information from floater logs. So there again, if any of you who have floated the Smith River before, you're probably familiar with our floater logs. We give one of those to each group, and they ask a lot of different questions. And then all that information is also compiled and put into our annual report at the end of the year. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Again, that's kind of showing you one end of the spectrum of fully permitted, fairly heavily managed river in the state of Montana. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Liam.
Thanks, Colin. And we'll go ahead and jump on over to the Blackfoot Corridor and Blackfoot Recreation Manager, Chrissy.
Hi there. Good evening. Thanks, Liam. Thanks for everyone for being here tonight. I'm Chrissy O'Shell. I'm the Blackfoot Recreation Manager. And what I'm here tonight is to talk about basically is the regulatory mechanisms on the Blackfoot River. Next slide. As Liam mentioned, there are definitely an array of different types of mechanisms we use for managing our rivers across the state. And the Blackfoot is just one of those examples. The Blackfoot River is obviously one of Western Montana's most popular rivers for different types of recreation. Again, it started mostly with angling. There's a rich history of recreation on the Blackfoot, and it's documented with crowding complaints going back to the 1960s. The 1960s, there's papers going back then that actually talk about different areas of the river where conflicts were occurring between landowners and recreationists. As Colin said, there's a lot of private land on the Blackfoot as well, where those conflicts were occurring. That led to a very unique mechanism that it exists nowhere else. It started off not as regulatory, but more of an agreement. It's called the River Recreation Corridor, and it runs from Russell Gates Fishing Access Site down to Johns Rood Fishing Access Site. And it was a handshake agreement that started in the late 70s, continued on until it was put into ARM in 2015. And that's listed there for your reference. The River Recreation Corridor is basically a document and an agreement that then it provides the basis for the special recreation area. And the regulations that exist within it are basically, number one, no glass is allowed in the River Recreation Corridor. No camping is allowed in the river recreation corridor, therefore overriding stream access for those that sign on to the river recreation corridor. Only in designated areas, and those are provided. Another thing it does is it gives an extra 50 feet to boaters and recreationists to use on private land. And it also provides a group that kind of oversees that area, and we meet annually. And that unique group has been involved in steering recreation in that area. The river recreation corridor is unlike anything else. So it's not something you're going to find anywhere else in the state or in the nation for that. We also have a special recreation permit program on the Blackfoot, and I'm going to go into that a little further in the next slide. The Blackfoot River has 27 FASs. 10 of those are campgrounds and 8 float-in campsites. Those float-in campsites are where we provide the public access to camp in the river recreation corridor where they're otherwise not allowed. Next slide, please. Our special recreation permit is not unique. It's like a couple of others in the state in that it's a permit that is required for organized groups and commercial use on the Blackfoot River. So basically you need to have a permit in order to conduct any commercial use or any organized use on the Blackfoot River. With that, you need, if you're fishing, you need to be a licensed outfitter. You have to have a certain amount of insurance, and that needs to also include our cooperating agency, the Bureau of Land Management. They are a cooperator on the special recreation permit. It further explains the permit in the 2010 management plan, and it further explains the reaches that the recreation permit has also enhanced. At this point, that is the only regulation that the permit, that special recreation permits puts on users. It doesn't have any kind of use limits. It has no allocation. It does require a use report at the end of the season. That use report is a huge tool in management for us. And without the special recreation permit, we would otherwise have no information to go off of for commercial use, when we already don't really have a lot of information to go off of for non-commercial use. Next slide, please. So in order to try and use that special recreation permit information, which is all we again get from the special recreation permit, is the report information. So in order to use that to its best abilities and to satisfy the management plan, we incorporate other types of monitoring and data collection that go hand in hand with the reports from commercial use. So obviously we're getting information from the commercial side of things, but we need to get information from non-commercial and from both, information that's not already included in those use reports. So we do surveys, we do in-person surveys every summer, and we've been doing them since 2006. We change the questions regarding special topics that might be going on, and it's really helpful when the BLM or we have a certain topic area that we'd like to focus on. We also do camera monitoring, and that one is a little unique to the Blackfoot. I know that there are some other regions of FWP that are starting to do it. We, in an effort to get a non-commercial use number, we basically set up cameras in each reach of the Blackfoot, and we count boats. Then someone comes back through, or watercraft. Someone goes back through and analyzes that. And I'm going to show you some of what the results of those look like, just so you can get an idea. We also have traffic counters. We are trying to up the quality of our traffic counters, specifically in the Blackfoot, because they can really be helpful. And then again, that SRP data for commercial use. Next slide, Liam. Thank you. And then what we were able to do with the cameras and the commercial use, we were able to take the total number of commercial use that was reported to us through our special recreation permit. We were able to separate that into these reaches that you see on this table. And then we were able to get the total number of watercraft. We basically subtract the commercial number and therefore get an estimate of non-commercial use in each of these reaches. And this table just gives you an example of one of the years and how we used it. This was when we were trying to understand the big jumps we had during COVID. So you can see in the different reaches that there's an FAS name. That's the beginning of each of the areas that was monitored. And then you can see the amount of watercraft counted, and then we can compare them to each other. Next slide, please. And then we also get a total. And even more interesting with that kind of data collection is being able to see watercraft type. And so we are actually able to break it down into how many canoes, how many drift boats, kayaks, paddleboards, rafts, and that kind of information is incredibly useful to us as we continue trying to find innovative and non-regulatory mechanisms to manage use. Next slide, Liam. So what's changing on the Blackfoot, and what are our regulatory mechanisms currently providing us? We are changing from what was once dominated by angling to now a much more diverse, different types of recreation use on the Blackfoot. We saw a very large spike and there's been a gradual increase in use on the Blackfoot. And again, diversification of the type of recreation on the Blackfoot. What we are trying to do right now in the region currently on the ground is work with our partners to figure out different ways to deal with some of the conflicts and crowding that are currently going on the river. So as we're talking about different ways to manage the river, we are going back to looking at the least restrictive methods that we might be able to get more creative with on the Blackfoot. And that's what I have for this river. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. And Cannon will be discussing the Missouri River. Cannon's a recreation manager out of Region 4. Go ahead and take it away, Cannon.
Thank you, Liam. Good evening. Yeah, my name is Cannon, and I'm a recreation manager up in north central Montana out of the Great Falls office. And that includes the Missouri River section from Holter Dam down to Cascade. Next slide, Liam. The Missouri River in this section has 16 public access sites. One of them is Bureau of Land Management, which is just downstream of Holter Dam. And then the remaining 15 sites are managed by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks as fishing access sites. 10 of these fishing access sites offer camping as well. Next slide. I'd also like to highlight a little bit different type of recreation access. And this is managed through the private land fishing access agreement. And this provides about 6 miles of year-round fishing access to a private ranch between basically Holter Dam down to Craig. The department compensates the landowner on an annual basis, and we have a 5-year agreement with this landowner to provide recreational access to the Missouri River along that frontage road between Wolf Creek and Craig at various parking areas for walk-weight anglers and recreationists to use the Missouri River. Next slide. What's different about the Missouri River from that of the previous presentations on the Smith River and Blackfoot River is that the Missouri River does not have allocated days, nor does it have permits issued for commercial use or recreational use on the Missouri River. Next slide. And also, unlike the Blackfoot River and the Smith River, the Missouri River also does not have a recreation management plan. However, I'd like to shine light on the Northwestern Energy Comprehensive Recreation Plan. This plan is prepared by Northwestern Energy to help document and fulfill this Project 2188 Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license responsibilities for operating its 9 hydropower developments on the Missouri and Madison River. This plan does not set public policy. The plan does not create requirements for managers to follow or implement. However, this plan does facilitate collaboration and communication among the various government entities that have management jurisdiction along the Missouri River and Madison River, which includes Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. This plan is used to understand resource issues and trends affecting recreational resources, understand which entity is responsible for key management recreation sites and facilities along the Missouri River, guide funding for recreation projects consistent with the existing plans adopted by various government entities. And this plan outlines how to apply for project funds from the Missouri Madison River Fund, which provides funding for recreation site improvements to the various government agencies involved along that corridor. Next slide. Yeah, through this plan that Northwestern Energy prepares, there is a level of data that is collected from Northwestern Energy. And this visitor use counts are collected and published annually as part of this comprehensive recreation plan. The primary objectives of the Missouri Madison Recreation Visitor Use Count study are to gain understanding the total visitation of public recreation sites within the corridor, understand use relationships between the public recreation sites, and to identify visitation trends over time. The visitor study is a key component to public recreation monitoring and provides Northwestern Energy and its stakeholders with information about use of project-related recreation sites and is an important monitoring element of the project's adopted recreation plan. This study provides information for periodic recreation reporting to FERC and is required as a condition of the project's license. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that Northwestern Energy is hosting 4 meetings to gather additional public input about recreation along these corridors, and these are the days and times. I just would like to also highlight that the Northwestern Energy process is different than the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks process. The Northwestern Energy, this just applies to their comprehensive recreation planning along the Missouri River and Madison. And if you want more information, you can find that on their website, northwesternenergy.com/recreation. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks, Liam.
Thank you, Paul and Chrissy and Cannon for presenting your information and some of the broader spectrum of how we manage and how we work with other agencies as well as other groups and other organizations on managing river recreation across the state, kind of that spectrum of restricted river systems to non-restricted, some of the voluntary opportunities as well in managing these spaces. And so that should give you a broad idea of kind of what is at disposal in terms of making these decisions. And so now we're going to jump into the piece where we start to hear from you and why you're here this evening. We are using a platform called Mentimeter, or Menti for short. Menti allows us to capture information, responses from participants on the Zoom call. This is anonymous information. This information will be summarized, so any comments, any things that you input into the Mentimeter will be compiled and provided in a report to the RAC. We'd like to keep these responses positive and concise when asked. And then as we kind of roll through these discussion questions and some of these questions that we're presenting to you and ask for your input, if you do have additional questions or if you would like to make a comment, you can go ahead and raise your hand using the raised hand icon. We'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to speak and we'll notify you as well. And so I'd like you to keep in mind as well, try and focus the responses to the current prompt at hand, as well as keep the scope in mind. So the scope here on river recreation is we're looking at class 1 waters and similar rivers with the capacity for river recreation use. So not necessarily your tiny little stream, but it could include some of those smaller river systems as well. Anything that has kind of that ability for river recreation to occur on it. And so kind of keep that in mind. And then in addition to that, comments will not be recorded as formal public comment at this time. Following the final recommendations presented by the RAC, there will be time for formal public comment. So we're going to go ahead and jump into where you'll need to set up. You can either open a new tab and go to www.menti.com. You can enter that code 6978-6185, and I'll leave this screen up there for a while. You can also, if you're already on a computer and just want to key in using your mobile phone, you can access it through the QR code. As once you enter into either the web page itself or through the QR code, you'll be presented with an initial screen. And then as I move through the questions, those will come up on your screen. You can still stay logged in here to the Zoom, so you can hear me as we're talking. You can switch back and forth, kind of responding on the Menti, and then raising your hand if you'd like to speak here. So we'll give just about a couple more seconds here for everyone to be able to kind of tune in.
Can Amber put that website and the code in the chat?
Yeah. And the code will stay at the top as well, as we kind of move through each of these questions. So if you get bounced out or kind of get discombobulated a little bit, you can always just go back to menti.com and use that code that's at the top there, at the top bar. All right. So we're going to go ahead and start with just kind of a general, first off, kind of conversation starter. Get yourself used to the Menti, to the platform, and go ahead and plug in what river recreation activities do you participate in. You can respond as many times as you feel. If there's numerous activities that you participate in, we have this set up as kind of a word bubble, so we'll start to see as people respond and input their information, we'll start to see what's more prominent, what's more common, and start to see also a spectrum of different types of recreation activities that are occurring across Montana. And this is kind of just to get us used to how this is functioning, as well as just kind of capturing that spectrum of use and the types of use that occur on and along waterways. You can still see that fishing is a very prominent activity. It's occurring across all of our, although we start to see, as I mentioned earlier, in that study, we're starting to see a lot of different activities and activity types occurring as well. Trying to recognize and understand how each of these activities plays an important role in your experience when you go to the river and spend time by the river. We'll give about 30 more seconds here to go ahead and plug in. Feel free to add anything that's unique. We want to be able to capture as many of those types of activities out there.
And can I add something, Liam?
Yeah.
You mentioned that we wouldn't be taking these as formal public comment, but everything that you are responding to here, either in Menti or the discussion that we'll have, we will be providing to the advisory council a summary report from everything here. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Yeah, yeah, that's an important clarification. Yeah, not formal public comment, but this information will be collected and compiled into a report for the RRAC for the RAC. Awesome. looks like we've got quite a bit of responses here. Some interesting ones about cleaning up trash, which is really unique and helpful. I love to see that. So, and fishing and kayaking, rafting, some of those big prominent activities. So we're going to go ahead and if you have any last ones you want to submit, go ahead and add those here in the next few seconds, and then we're going to bump on to the next question. All right. This question is going to be asking, what aspects of river recreation experience do you enjoy the most? We didn't necessarily put a limit on this, so if you could try to identify some of those really important experiences, what about going to the river do you enjoy the most? What's the reason that you go to the river? Is it for the activity? Is it for the challenge? Is it for is it for the solitude? What about it gets you motivated? And what's that expectation when you go there? What is the expectation of what you're going to enjoy? And as you can see in the chat as well, yeah, if anyone's getting disconnected, you can always log back into menti.com and just use that code there at the top. It'll take you right to the current screen and the current question that we're on. And as I mentioned, each of these questions we're going to kind of move in a more discussion oriented direction. So kind of these first ones are just kind of plug and play and kind of get some input, get a broader sense of what type of what you enjoy, and then we'll kind of move into some more discussion. So I'll go ahead, and if we have any more responses, go ahead and plug them in here. I'll give about 30 more seconds. Fantastic. It looks like those are most of the responses that we have now. The next question is very similar to this last question, other than we're trying to identify what about your recreation experience do you enjoy the least? What is it about something when you're headed to the river that you're not looking forward to if it were to occur, something if it does occur when you're out there, what is it about that experience that really kind of might put you off, displace you from that, going to that space? We're starting to see, a number of examples of what that looks like. Feel free to kind of build off of those, what's showing up on the screen. And if you have multiple kind of reasons or aspects to your river recreation experience that you don't always enjoy, something that has repetitively come up, or maybe it just happened a few times, go ahead and plug that in as well. Fantastic. And as, yeah, we can kind of see crowding is one of those primary concerns, congestion and crowding around, these access sites, something that's been on the forefront of our minds. It's managing for, these social issues. How do we manage those, and identifying that, that is affecting the experience that river users are having along these corridors. So give about 10 more seconds here to add any last thoughts. Okay, we're going to go ahead and head to the next question here. This is where we're starting to get a little bit more specific about some of the input that we'd like to receive from you. So what types of information is useful and necessary to engage in river recreation activities? Is there certain types of information that would help your river recreation experience when you head out to the rivers? And what type of information is that? Is that, and how do you, we'll get to the kind of the next question, but for this is just what is it that you need to decide if you're going to be headed out to the river for the day to help support that planning ahead piece? How do you, to avoid maybe some of those unwanted kind of experiences, what type of information might be useful for you? Wonderful. Yeah, it's starting to see some very helpful identifiers of kind of the type of information, water levels and those boat ramp etiquette. How do we, behave and interact with others when we're at the boat ramp or at these access sites? Some of those regulation pieces. How do we, these types of information that would really help support, even before you get to the river, what things might be like when you're headed there, and how that's going to support kind of your river recreation experience, what you're expecting as you get there. I'll give about 10 more seconds if you want to add any last couple comments there. Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and head to the next question here. This next question is now discussing kind of what those communication channels are. So we've identified now some of those, the types of information that's needed, what types of information we need prior, headed to the river recreation corridor or to the access site, to the river itself. Now, where would you like to get that information? What's the most accessible for you? What makes the most sense? How is that disseminated? And what are those channels? What are the ones you currently use, and what are the ones that you kind of think might be really useful in the future? I think it's helpful here as well to kind of think of this conversation or this question itself, and what those communication channels are, what's available for FWP, what are some of the the pieces that we can address to help support communication and information sharing among for river recreationists. How is that best disseminated? Fantastic. I'll give about 10 more seconds here, and we'll head to the next question. I'm going to go ahead and head on to the next question here. Now we were trying to identify some of the current trends, emerging trends or technologies that you think could benefit river recreation management. We have a lot of information. We disseminate information in various different ways across the state around river recreation. Are there any additional kind of ideas or technologies that you think very similar to that's kind of communication channel question we just had, but with this one, we're thinking a little bit more broadly about what type of technologies are out there. Are there ways that we can not only disseminate that information, but is there other ways that we can provide management tools, new technologies to allow us to really understand what's going on these rivers? Other types of methods that you're aware of, other rivers that you've recreated on across, across the entirety of the country or the world where they're implementing and deploying different types of technologies to be able to identify the type of use, the impacts of use in river recreation use on these rivers. As we start to kind of collect these last few questions here, we're going to be moving into a set of questions that will start to look a little different. And at that time, we'll be asking if you're willing and you'd like to expand on your thoughts as we kind of move into these next questions. Feel free to kind of raise your hands. We'll be tracking those raised hands if you want to provide additional kind of comment, discussion around your responses and your answers as we move along. So I'll give a few more seconds here to place any more information here into this question. And I'll remind you as well, just to identify and respond based on what the prompt is asking. Right, I'm going to go ahead and head on to the next slide here. This question we're asking, do restrictions on river use impact your recreation experience? And if so, how? So we're trying to identify some of these rivers that do have restrictions in place across the state. How do these restrictions impact your experience? Is it positive? Is it negative? And what types of way is that impacting your overall experience? And if you could include kind of how that might be impacting it, if it's a sense of limitation, if it's an increase in opportunity, if you can help kind of parse that out, that would be helpful, being specific and concise.
And again, if you would prefer to initiate a discussion and talk about this, you may raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
And feel free, yes, as you enter your comments, you feel free to raise your hand and we can expand on some of these discussions, some of these responses that are being provided here. And I encourage you, if you do wish to make a comment or add some discussion, please do raise your hand. We'd like to engage as much of this into the conversation, especially through these next few questions. Generate some of these ideas, kind of work around the conversation, the dialogue that we're providing here, the platform here, to be able to present some more information and ideas kind of within the workshop itself. Wonderful. Thank you for everyone who's kind of responded to this question. This can be a challenging question as well, thinking about just those, if you hadn't been on a river that's necessarily restricted or limited. We do have the opportunities still available out there in diverse number of settings. And so kind of trying to think about ahead, if there was a river, if you hadn't been on one that's restricted, how that might impact your experience. Does look like we have Jerry.
Yes, I'm gonna unmute Jerry now. Jerry, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in many river recreation discussions with FWP over the years. And I have always personally pushed hard. Well, I must say this is, for me, it's specifically on the Blackfoot, but in general, it applies through most of their watersheds. Every river is unique. Here on the Blackfoot, the increased overcrowding, certainly in my view, calls for putting in a permitting system to accomplish what everyone has wanted for a long time, is to manage how much traffic is on here. And to me, there's no other way to do it. Signage will not stop somebody if they show up at an access point. and there's a sign that says, "Oh, avoid overcrowding." Well, they're going to go. I mean, I don't blame them. I would too. But if there was a permitting system in place, it would work. It works on the Smith. Now the Smith is unique, but like I mentioned in my printed comment here on the screen, every river is unique. And they put permit processes on the West Fork of the Bitterroot, on the Big Hole, on the Madison, to varying degrees of success, but none of those plans are the same, and they all get tweaked to adjust them going forward to make them easier and easier for the public. I think, for instance, on the Blackfoot, the idea of preserving the solitude that the river is famous for is more important than providing as much access as possible from for the public. The public should have equal rights to use it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't put some kind of limits on a daily basis for how many are on there, so that the people that do use it get to experience that pristine feeling of wilderness and solitude that is otherwise lost if it's allowed to turn into a water park, with it, which it will, if we don't put some kind of control mechanisms on it. You can unmute me now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, I appreciate you initiating some of those discussion questions, some of those thoughts that you have, and how we kind of share and have that dialogue between everyone here on this call and on this workshop. And so appreciate you initiating that. I see a lot of responses here on the screen, and just with just about 12 minutes left, I want to make sure that we do get to as many questions as possible. We certainly want to leave some time for additional discussion, whether it's in past questions or some of the material that's presented. But I'm going to move along to this next question here. And once again, if you have any additional comment you'd like to add to these questions, feel free to raise your hand. And how can management address conflicting interests between recreational users? So what are some ideas, possible solutions that you think in identifying how management, FWP, other agencies, what have you, can address some of these conflicting issues, some of these social issues between not only between different types of use, but among recreation users of the same type? Are there specific methods? Are there specific approaches that you think that would help kind of identify some solutions? You can think about both the access sites or being on the river itself. See a number of responses around education. It seems like an ongoing common kind of identifier of continued education, the need for additional education, ethics, and etiquette. I mean, some responses around data collection as well. See some barbecues. Those are always wonderful. Be a pretty large barbecue for everyone in river recreation, but we can do it. If anyone wants to expand on their responses here, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll kind of keep cruising along so we can get to two of the more important questions that I think will have a little bit change in how we respond to them. And I'll explain that once we get to them. I'll give about 30 more seconds here to add any more additional comments. Looks like we have Denny.
Hear
me?
Should be able to talk. Yep.
Okay. My comments here are a couple fold. I do believe in education before the river user has left home, if at all possible, so that they know the rules and regulations which are going to be implemented if there is regulation, so that people know, what to do with their human waste. Are dogs allowed? How busy a put-in might be, how to work to figure out maybe a different put-in might be a better space. When are the busiest times? And I do come from an outfitting background, and I'm cognizant of some of the comments which are out there. I do think that a lot of outfitters are already regulated, at least in my neck of the woods, which is in Region 1. So I do think that there's also we have so many people who have moved into the state and are now recreating in our rivers, and we need to figure out a way to include them in our conversation so that it's not like where they come from. To help them instill the values of what we all love: leave no trace, giving space to anglers, to not parking their vehicles right on the edge of the river system. Thank you.
Thank you, Denny. Appreciate the comment there and the conversation continuing here. And we're going to move along to a couple additional questions just to make sure that we can capture all the input that we can get. So with the next two questions, there are primary kind of standalone questions that are really going to help like tease out some of these broad overarching kind of ideas and goals. Some of these, what is the biggest challenge for river recreation management in Montana? You do have the opportunity to, I believe, input up to 3 responses. And then with each of those responses, you actually have the opportunity to vote on the responses that are displayed. And so you'll have the opportunity to select a number of them if someone else is generating an idea or a challenge that they think is kind of the biggest challenge in river recreation management today here in Montana. You can kind of upvote that as you see fit. And I believe you have a number of votes as well. I think up to 3 votes as well for that. So as we start to generate some of these ideas around, what is that biggest challenge, you can go ahead and add your vote to the one that you might agree with as well. And then want to make sure we leave enough time for discussion. We can bounce either to the next question first and then kind of go back to this, discussing both the biggest challenge and the next question. Just want to make sure we are able to provide you the opportunity to respond. So we'll hold off on, you can go ahead and raise your hand, but we'll hold off on unmuting you until after we get through the next question. But feel free to take some more time on responding to this question and providing some votes. Once we have a number of responses here, listed out kind of biggest challenges, I'll go ahead and move to that next slide so we can start kind of the voting process. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds here to add any additional comments on what you think is the biggest challenge. We'll move to the next slide, and at that point you can vote. And I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide and go ahead and vote on which ones you agree with, what you find to be. Hopefully that worked.
I don't think it did, Liam. We
Well,
were only allowed to submit one response, so.
Okay.
So,
Well, we'll go ahead and collect some responses here for what is the long-term goal for river recreation management in Montana. So being able to go ahead and provide your responses here. This is the last question we have here for the workshop. So I believe you have your ability to respond here. And then if you want to add any additional comments, feel free to raise your hand. And we'll go ahead and kind of start the discussion there as we kind of start to see some of these responses generate here. I encourage you, if you have any additional comments that you would like to add to your responses, and it doesn't have to be specific to this question, any previous, if you'd like to elaborate on any of your previous responses, any thoughts that are coming up right now, feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you and provide you that opportunity. I know we just have a couple minutes left here. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so we'll leave this response here up for everyone at this time, and then feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, any additional comment that you'd like to make. Looks like Joe has raised your hand. Let's see if we can get you unmuted here, Joe.
Joe, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Joe, can you unmute yourself? Your hand is up and we gave you permission to talk. No. While we're waiting for others to raise their hands or Joe to unmute, I just want to add that the report, when it's final, before we give it to the advisory council, we'll make it available on that River Rec Advisory page that Amber put in the chat a while ago. So keep your eyes open for that. We will be putting that on our website. Amber just put their web page in there again. We have Shane now raising his hand.
Shane should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, you have me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. One thing I wish I had written 2 questions ago on the biggest challenge, having lived here for 20 plus years, we've become so accustomed to solitude on the rivers, and we've watched it change dramatically over the last 5 years, specifically. It's been a slow change, but the last 5 have been a lot. And watching, commercial recreational management attempts on the Madison River. I used to work over there for a fly shop and booked a lot of trips, almost to the point to where it made me not want to go on the river anymore. But we've watched it grow, and we've found that it's very difficult to get people to want to agree that management is needed, and then to agree on what management is. So I think probably the largest challenge is going to be getting people to be okay with giving up a little bit to experience a lot more. Simply put, being okay with management and changes on river access. That's all.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah, appreciate that comment there, and providing a little more deeper conversation around, yeah, what that looks like for you, what that experience has been for you. I know we are at 7:32, so we will be kind of wrapping things up here. If you have any final responses here for this last question, go ahead and include them. And then we can, if you will stay on for a couple more minutes here, if you have any questions about kind of presentation, anything about the process, what material was presented, any of the questions, we'll go ahead and hang on here for a couple more minutes. Otherwise, I really appreciate everyone being here this evening. As mentioned, we do have 2 more workshops coming up. You do not need to attend each one. They'll be very similar in nature, although if you have friends, others, you can go ahead and share this information, make sure that they're aware of these workshops that are occurring. We'll go ahead, provide you kind of just the last little bit here. This is just about the Q&A, similar process. And then our last screen here, for any contact information, you can go ahead and reach out to myself, Liam Harry. My email's there on the screen, or Deb O'Neill. We will be available to answer any of your questions. There's additional links here that have been provided in the chat if you need to access any of the links that have been presented on. And most importantly, pay attention to that to the RAC webpage. A lot of this information, recordings from these workshops will be added to that page as well. And so as this process continues and kind of moves through the fall and into the winter, more and more information will be available there. So once again, thank you again for being here this evening. I look forward to a thorough and an exciting process on identifying some of the challenges, kind of the solutions moving forward with river recreation management across Montana. And we'll go ahead and hang out here for a couple more minutes if there are any questions.
George, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Go ahead, George. I think you're unmuted. If you're talking, George, we can't hear you.
George, if you should have the ability to speak right now, George, although we can't hear you if you are speaking right now. I don't want to take up too much more of anyone's time here this evening. As I mentioned, feel free to reach out to either Deb or myself if you have any kind of follow-up questions. And as mentioned before, we have 2 more workshops coming up. Stay tuned on the RAP webpage there for any upcoming information, and feel free to use those links to your references. Otherwise, we really appreciate you all being here this evening. And thank you for the presenters and staff being here to present some of this information. And we look forward to providing a kind of a report out from these conversations in the next month or so. So thank you again for being here, and that will conclude our workshop for this evening.